So welcome everyone to today's webinar. It's a pleasure for me to be moderating this session for the Gerhard Center. And thank you all for being here today. We look forward to a very rich and fruitful discussion on a very timely topic. Our speaker today is Dr. Amit Kapoor. I have the honor to introduce him. Dr. Kapoor is the Honorary Chairman of the Institute for Competitiveness in India. He's the President of the India Council on Competitiveness and the Editor-in-Chief of Thinkers. He is the Chair of the Social Progress Imperative and Shared Value Initiative in India, and he sits on the board of competitiveness initiatives in Mexico, Netherlands, Italy, and France. He is an affiliate faculty for the microeconomics and competitiveness and value-based healthcare delivery courses of Institute Strategy and Competitiveness at the Harvard Business School and an instructor with Harvard Business Publishing in the area of strategy, competitiveness, and business models. Dr. Kapoor has a PhD in industrial economics and business strategy and has received the Ruth Green Memorial Award for writing the best case of the year. He is also the author of 2 books on India, Riding the Tiger, on how to execute business strategy in India, published in 2016, and more recently, the author of The Age of Awakening, the story of the Indian economy since independence. Today, Dr. Kapoor will give us a talk about the rising shift towards authoritarian and populist leaders across global democracies. He will discuss the underlying causes behind this trend from economic discontentment of the voters to rising anti-immigrant sentiment. The talk will discuss these developments across leading democracies and its impact on capitalism, with special focus on a number of countries, including the US, Britain, India, and Brazil. So without further ado, I give the floor to our distinguished speaker, who will talk for 25 minutes approximately, and then we will open the floor for questions and discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Dina, for the kind introduction. And I must thank Ali for really inviting me for this. And so just a very quick note, my presentation is based on my new book, which just got released on the 14th. It's called Disrupting Democracies, and it's volume 3, supported by the Bertelsmann Foundation. So that's where I'm actually coming from. But having said that, as to what Dina was saying is something very important in terms of saying as to how democracies are changing across the world. And there are 3 fundamental things that we are seeing that leaders are really talking about, all the set of democracies that I'm going to be talking about. One is that they are all talking about making their countries great again. And when you say they're talking about making their countries great again, they are really talking about getting embedded in a certain set of history, which could be fairly mythical at points in time. I do get surprised when US says that they're going to make their country great again, for a simple reason, and that US is a very young country from a very simple point of view, from a historical background point of view. And so it is a country which has achieved greatness, or which has achieved a lot of success in the last 200 or 300 years. So what is the kind of history that we are really talking about? And then, of course, if you really talk about great things from the past or whatever, the question is that we always have to look at the future and see as to how future has to pan out rather than the past. So it's a very deeply embedded issue in terms of what's right and what's wrong. The second thing that everybody is talking about is anti-immigration sentiment. And when you talk about anti-immigration sentiment, the tragedy on anti-immigration sentiment is that it could be based on a certain religion or a certain way that you're actually looking at things. And a lot of people don't want to talk about it, but there is an issue here that we have to grapple and talk about. So it is about fear psychosis and so on and so forth that we really need to understand. The third thing that everybody is talking about is strengthening the borders. Again, related to immigration to a certain extent, but when you're talking about strengthening the borders, it's about the whole idea of land acquisition, control, and all those set of ideas. But having said that, let's take a step back in terms of understanding as to how democracies have evolved over a period of time. If you really look at democracies, I think they've been following a certain trend. A typical trend, if you really look at it, it was the phase one of the growth of democracies was happening from early 1800s till about 1920s. And that is when democracy started taking shape in the world, that started talking about voting, voter rights, individual rights, and so on and so forth. But then after about the Spanish flu, we are talking about a very interesting time right now. Exactly 100 years back, 1918, there was this whole huge Spanish flu that actually happened, and it did what I call seed what a lot of interesting things in terms of like how democracies will function. And that's the first time when the retreat of democracies actually happened. And when you talk about retreat of democracies in the 1920s, it also gave rise to authoritarianism, because that is exactly the period when you also saw the rise of Hitler and what you would actually call as the Antichrist and so on and so forth. But then there was another phase when you really talk about the end of the World War. And that's when, after the end of the Second World War, the rise of democracies actually happened. And then suddenly there was another reversal that we actually saw somewhere in the 1960s uh, when there was this whole huge spike in military coups in Latin America and so on and so forth. And then another phase of growth of democracies actually happened in the 1970s when there were different countries who were starting to adopt democracy. Today, if you really look at it, there are close to about 100 countries who have adopted democracy as a way of life. But then at the end of the day, there's something very, very powerful that has happened after 2008, that we have seen a huge rise of populist leaders across the board. So whether you talk about places like US, or you talk about Italy, you talk about France, of course, there could be countries wherein the populist leader has not really got elected, or an authoritarian leader has not got elected, but there were those underlying currents that actually did exist for those sets of things to actually happen. But the question that we beg to answer, need to answer, or we need to look at, or the idea that we are grappling with, is why does this all happen, and what is really triggering all this change that we are really seeing? So very quickly, I'll want to go through my set of slide decks as well, and I'll be sharing it with you. So if you really look at it, what happened is one of the biggest things that actually happened in the last, I would rather say, 5 or 7 years, is the idea of Brexit. Came as a shocker, but the question that we have to really understand is what propelled people to move towards this direction in the United Kingdom to really go for it. And for especially a country which was a very large empire, where people would say that an empire where the sun would never set, and so forth. So suddenly, I think there is huge thing within the idea of Britain, a country which was all about globalization, which was all about trade, when they were actually ruling the world effectively, and then suddenly they lose out. And now they just do not want to actually be part of any global system. They want to be actually going away from Brexit and things. And what has caused this anxiety within the minds of the people? So if you really look at it, there were two times when the whole referendum has actually happened. But then in the UK history, 68% of the people in 1975 said that they want to stay within what I call the European Union. And suddenly in 2016, 52% just simply wanted to go away. And then that is how that whole thing changed. But what caused this thing to really happen? Why people wanted to leave? Are there economic reasons, or there is something else? I think there are multiple things that were actually happening at a similar point of time. But remember, the most important thing is the same set of people who must have actually said they want to be part of the European Union were the set of people who were probably disenchanted, and they wanted to exit after 1975 to 2016. So in less than about 40 years, things just changed into a very different direction. So what actually did happen is that we have to understand. But then if you really look at it, it was parts of England, Wales, where people wanted to leave, and that's a larger percentage that we are actually seeing, or a shift that is happening. But then if you really look at it, all of the numbers that are here are absolutely stunning in terms of people who are looking at leaving. But this is where we need to actually see how things are actually happening. So if you really look at it, it's all about disparity, as you would look at. It is the larger set of people. If you really look at it, the income quartile shares ratios, what is happening is that the rich were actually getting richer, the poor were just not really getting the kind of benefits that they should actually get. From a competitiveness viewpoint, and the numbers that you would really look at, the gains that we have actually seen in productivity in the world in the last 50 odd years, it's close to about 90 odd percent, but gains in terms of real incomes has been fairly minuscule for people. And as we look at it, there's also something very interesting that has happened, and that is about the educational achievement and how people wanted to leave. So people who wanted to leave the system were the set of people who were not very well educated, or people who have not really gone to the university system. So this leads us to an important question as to the importance of education, importance of understanding, because and understand and looking at things from a fresher perspective or a newer perspective, because education does that. But the tragedy, again, if you really look at it in the present context, I would rather say uh, in the last 20 years, the world has seen a very dramatic shift in terms of how education is, how knowledge is actually being seen, especially after 1999 and especially after the internet came into existence. What we have seen is that people started thinking that they know too much. So there is a lot of information that has been made available, but with very severe lack of analytical ability that we are seeing. In fact, I do make some very oddball statements at point in time, and a lot of people might actually hate me for saying it. But the question is, and what I perceive is that the overall IQ of the world seems to have actually gone down in the last 20 odd years. Because if you really look at intelligence, intelligence is a function of memory, reading, analysis. And what has happened in the last 20 years is that all of this is actually going down, and it is going down across the ages. It's not just that the young are not reading, it's also about the old who are not reading. And there is also this whole huge advent of social media, which is causing a lot of anxiety, wherein people can actually get enamored by a lot of fake news that actually gets into the system. Uh, and then, of course, a very interesting set of numbers do come through as to who are the people who believe in fake news. Is it the young or the old? What we are actually seeing is people beyond the age of 65 tend to believe in fake news far more than the young people. So, what is getting people to really get into this kind of thinking is something that we'll have to answer. But then again, as I was actually talking about income, what you would see is that in real terms, the income levels have just moved from £100 in 1977 in the UK to about £205 in 2016. So about 40 odd years, the incomes have just doubled for a lot of people. And this is the median weekly disposable income per person. So what this tells us is that there is a very severe issue in terms of how income has actually gone to the people. But having said that, so there is this huge level of what I call fighting for the future, the correlation between income and Euroscepticism. People who were actually earning less were the set of people who wanted to leave. And then why was this actually happening? This was actually happening for a simple reason, that the income levels for people in Britain was actually going down. It is, if you really talk about the London region, the boroughs in London, that's where people were actually making money, but it was not. They were not making money outside of London area, and that is where people start feeling disenchanted. So you would also see or notice that people who were outside of London are the who have actually voted against the idea of living in the European system or the European Union. And then if you really look at the number of expressions here, this is all about Twitter. So the leave impressions were far bigger, 54%, to the neutral ones were just 26%. So what you're noticing here is that the debate was for leave on the social media as well. But then if you really look at the state of democracy, so what we are seeing is there is this whole huge fall of grace of certain sorts. Like it's still, again, I think UK is moving towards a flawed democracy with the kind of leaders that we are actually seeing there. And that's going to be something very, very important for us to really see. But this is, again, the most important point that you're actually looking at. So when you talk about the boroughs and how the difference between income levels are changing, so there is growing income disparity between rich and poor UK regions. So what you notice here is that the gross domestic household income and the variations that you're seeing. So what you're seeing is the boroughs who are there. So the poorest boroughs are just about 15%, and the topmost, you're actually seeing larger sets of income going to lesser and lesser people. That's where it is. But let's talk about India in that context. So what's happening in India is, again, very interesting, but I see India from a little more positive orientation and things. So there is something called the rise of cultural nationalism, definitively. and the assertion of a certain identity and the way you're looking at. But then again, being part of the empire and the basis of division based on some ideas at that point in time, uh, you might actually, I disagree with that idea that it should not have happened on the basis of religion. But then once it has actually happened, there are some things that have actually underplayed. But then at the end of the day, I see India as a fairly robust, what do you call, democratic system. And there are always those questions from people in terms of saying that is it basis of language or what is it that keeps India as a resilient democracy? Even though there are societal structures, there is that caste system that actually exists. But if you really look at it, the very thing as to what keeps India resilient is then there is this whole huge debate that you actually ensuing debate that you would see or hear, and that is that India is moving towards the wrong direction or whatever. But at the end of the day, the larger population, which is the dominant population in India, being Hindus, close to about 80%. The question that I always ask is that if India did not want to be a democracy and a secular democracy, uh, and then it had to be those 80% who had to decide that. So 80% are the people who are saying that India has to be a secular democracy. That is why India is moving into a direction. So there are going to be some skirmishes here and there, but at the end of the day, you are continuing being a fairly resilient democracy, which actually functions in an interesting way. But what we have actually seen is something interesting. Again, this is a basis how the parties function. So if you really look at it, India has actually had a fairly interesting evolution of party structures. That is where the Congress was actually one of the what I call big uh, uh, parties, which has actually lost over a period of time, and then that was the rise of the right wing party, as you would want to say it. But I think they were more embedded in the idea of cultural nationalism and moving forward. But if you really look at it, what we were actually looking at is something interesting. This is how Congress has actually moved down. But at the end of the day, what I always say is there was this whole idea of development that actually pushed forward for this change in the Indian context. And when you talk about this pushing forward of this change, it was more from when the BJP government came in 2014. It was towards making India more resilient as an economy, more robust as an economy, and it was a developmental agenda that actually got into action. But then again, the question that a lot of people will ask and do ask is, what is the reason for the rise of the right-wing Hindu party into India? I always say it is because of the mistakes that the liberals actually made in the past. The problem is that across the world, I think what we have actually seen is that the people have become tolerant of intolerance. And when you become tolerant of intolerance, that is when problems actually arise. And the liberal people, the question is, when you talk about the rise of authoritarianism or whatever, is it an outcome of, it is an outcome of what? It is an outcome of flawed thinking of liberal view. Which they actually did, and that sowed the seeds for the rise of authoritarian leaders. So you cannot actually have had made those mistakes, but once those mistakes are made, you actually see certain rise. But you will have to correct those mistakes and things. But in the Indian context, we also see that there was this set of mistakes that Congress has actually made. And I'm not saying that Congress was liberal at all. Congress actually made some classical errors that actually sowed the seeds for rise of interesting times. And probably more driven towards economic development and so on and so forth. But having said that, a lot of people criticize the BJP, but I would like to share here that BJP is far more, what do you call, popular as a party than any other party in the history of India. So that is where things are very interesting, like close to about 40 odd percent, more than 45%, or close to 45% people actually vote for the BJP. And that's a very, very high percentage in a democratic system, which is first past the post. So at present, the prime minister that we have, Prime Minister Modi, is the most popular leader that India has actually seen in the whole Indian history since independence. So that's something very, very interesting that we have actually seen. But having said that, so you will see that they have started dominating and moving forward. Very quickly, I'll just move towards the whole huge issue of US. If you really look at US is a very, very interesting case as to how things have actually panned out. And a lot of times the question is actually asked as to why is that US has actually gone into this direction that it has. I always say that, again, two critical things. One is the mistakes that the liberals as you would want to call them, have actually made in the US by just focusing on the wrong set of ideas and being tolerant to intolerance. The second thing was economics. And when you talk about economics, we just have to understand this in a little deeper way. And the numbers are very interesting. Out of 3,007 counties that US has, what we have seen is that 2,400 counties where Donald Trump was a popularly elected person or a leader in the previous elections, these were the counties which were not really contributing a lot to the US economy. So 600 counties where Secretary Clinton was a more popular leader, that is where economic upliftment was happening or economy was doing well. So there seems to be a very interesting relationship between economic performance and how the leaders actually get elected. So economic disparity does cause a lot of anxiety. So the question is, a lot of people tend to say that, oh, Secretary Clinton was a very popular leader. In fact, we tend to forget that Secretary Clinton was a very popular leader in economically well-developed places like Massachusetts or New York or California, DC area, but in the rest of the places where economic upliftment had not actually happened, that is where Donald Trump was a popular leader. So that means if you're actually leaving people behind, that is going to actually cause a lot of anxiety. So what is right set of things for leaders to focus on? If you really want to keep resilient democracies, then the question is that you have to talk about or you have to focus on economic development. If you don't do it, people will actually start talking about something else. In fact, quite interestingly, countries which are the Scandinavian countries. Like, let me give you an example here. Scandinavian countries, very democratic and things, and they're doing fairly well economically, and that is what they focus on. And there is something very important here. Like there is something called as the atheism index, and I just did try to dabble into this as well. So what we did see is that the countries which are atheistic, they have done better economically. But now there is no correlation here, causality here. There seems to be a correlation. But what seems to be getting answered here is that if economies do well, people focus on economic upliftment. They actually don't focus on religious issues and so on and so forth. But the moment you are not doing well economically, people start focusing on religious issues. And that is what actually becomes important. And that is where people start fearing the issues of immigration, and it'll actually be through religion or whatever, and that's how things will actually tilt up. And if you really look at this is something very interesting, again, the dark side of capitalism, as I would actually say. The richest 5%, if you really look at the income gains over the last 60, 70 years in the US, the richest 5% have gained close to about 200% over a period of time. And then the poorest 20%, their income gains are very, very minuscule. So, and what we have also seen during the times of the pandemic is that the rich are actually controlling far more wealth now than before the pandemic. Their wealth has grown far bigger than what we have actually seen for the poor. So what we are seeing is that the gap is now increasing between the rich and the poor, and that is actually going to be a very, very dangerous blow to the way the democratic systems are actually going to be working. So what the question here is that when you talk about income gains now since 1980, this is again a very interesting number that you're seeing. So the top 1% has seen gains of 226%, and the middle 60% has just seen something like 47%. So this is something very scary as to how things have actually happened. So the wealth accumulation at the top also leads us to a very important question, and that is is our capitalistic model right? Because the model that we are actually talking about from a capitalism viewpoint is dangerous in terms of saying accumulation of wealth with very few. So we need to move towards some right set of economic models where we are saying it has to be something like shared value, or it has to be conscious capitalism, or whatever be the term that you actually want to use. But we will have to relook at things. In fact, this is where I always say you will have to bring the idea of social objectives and economic objectives together. So it cannot be that, oh, there is just an economic objective, which is just GDP and GDP per capita or productivity or whatever. It has to be about social issues as well. So you have to solve the social problems. In fact, the whole election debate within the US, as you see, the Obamacare issue or whatever is a social issue. And that is what you're really talking about. And then there is this whole economic issue that you're actually seeing. But at the end of the day, politicians will have to work towards solving the social challenges, and they will have to create capitalistic models that exist that way, wherein both the things are actually getting bridged. And that's the same thing that you have to look at. as an enterprise also. In fact, enterprises will have to work very hard to really creating the right set of models and right set of compensations. In fact, there was this whole huge debate that happened for Jeff Bezos recently, wherein his income levels have increased tremendously during the pandemic, or his stock price or his wealth has increased from a stock market perspective. But then the people who are working with Amazon have not really gained that much. So there are always those questions that are actually going to be asked. So what is the right way that owners and stakeholders or shareholders should actually behave and look at things? But then at the end of the day, making America again is one of those interesting things. But then 17 states had unemployment rise in 2015, and Trump was voted for by 13 of them. So this is something very interesting. Dina, I know you've come on the screen. Just give me 5 more minutes, and then we'll go to the questions. I'll run through it very quickly. And then, of course, so if you really look at it, there's also something very interesting in terms of how news is actually getting circulated. I did talk about fake news and everything, but then there seems to be a severe lack of reading and in-depth analysis, and this is what we are seeing, the rise of Fox News. So the rise of Fox News also tells us something very interesting, that there seems to be a tirade against science and against logic, as we are seeing right now. But then we have to fight it out. But then if you really look at it, Trump is an amazingly popular leader, has tons and tons of people who are following him on Twitter. So what we've also seen in this whole huge world is that initially those conversations were very different. Like it was a party conversation through the newspapers or whatever, but now suddenly a top leader can actually converse with his followers or her followers very, very quickly. But what you see here is that the fake news, if you really look at Americans age 65 and older, 11% of them did share fake news. And then it was just about 18 to 29, just 3% did it. So there seems to be a thing that people who are older seem to share fake news or fall prey to that than anybody else. And then there is also a very clear understanding that it's the older people who are voting for authoritarian leaders. The youth wants something very different. The youth is actually more towards liberal view to the world and so on and so forth. Liberty is dimming lights. So if you really look at it, there is this Freedom in the World report ranking. There seems to be a severe drop in the US. And very quickly getting into Brazil, what I really wanted to talk about Brazil is that Brazil shows a very interesting different set of trend. And I just want to show something very interesting. So if you really look at it, the inequality in Brazil is actually reduced over a period of time. And this is a very important figure that is on the screen right now. So the top 10% gained there was a rise there. 50% was also rise, but it is the middle class which actually felt disenchanted in Brazil because they felt, oh, everything's getting sucked out of them and being given to the poor and whatever. And this is where the rise of Bolsonaro actually happened. So if you really look at Bolsonaro's thing, so what we did see was that it's the poor, rich regions who have actually voted for Bolsonaro, not the poor regions. So the rich voted for Bolsonaro. So if you really look at it, 78% of the rich have actually voted for Bolsonaro, and that's where it is. So there was this also a disparity that existed. The middle class started getting disenchanted. So you have to find that right balance that actually exists to really make democracies function. So what I'm saying is that there are three set of very big points here. So one is about identity as to how that can actually define things. The second thing is about inequality. That we need to answer. And then, of course, there is this whole huge social argument that we need to set right. That is that in terms of like social objectives and economic objectives have to come together to really solve the problems and the challenges that we actually see in the world. So these are some of my initial remarks, Dina. I hope I made some sense, but over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kapoor, for this very important and timely presentation, especially in light of the US election, which we are all watching very closely. I invite the participants to send their questions on the chat. We already have a few questions, but please submit your questions on the chat and we will take them as we go. I have a few comments that I'd like to start with, and then we'll start taking the questions. I wanted to ask you if you think what's happening across these democracies is a long-term trend or kind of an electoral cycle where, things will shift back to the left and then go to the right again as they have done, over the past decades? Are we seeing a systemic change taking us towards a new reality, or just a temporary shift to the right? Because sometimes it seems that we're seeing more fundamental changes. So I wanted to get your thoughts on this. For example, if Biden becomes the president of the US in the next election, does that mean, that this phase is over, or does it have longer term consequences? Also, um, this looks like a global trend, or more of a transnational trend. It's not just localized in a few countries, it's even across developed and developing countries. So what does that mean also for the future of international politics, with the rise of nationalism and populism? We've seen that happen before in the 1930s, and the consequences were dire. So also, what are your thoughts on this? My final question, or I have two more questions. One has to do with the paradox of, the losers of globalization and liberalization voting for conservative right-wing parties who embrace policies that are blatantly anti-poor. For someone like Trump, who wants to slash, universal healthcare, to cut taxes for the rich, why would the losers embrace him? I find this very bewildering to my thinking, and it's happening in the UK and elsewhere, where kind of the people who are losing the most out of free market economy are voting for radical, free market economy policies. And finally, I think you addressed this, in the end. Does capitalism have solutions for these problems, or do we have to look outside of capitalism? Can capitalism evolve and fix, some of the problems that have led to rising inequality and environmental degradation and so forth? So these are my questions. There are a bit too many. Would you like to take all the questions in one go, or to address them, few by few?
So if you're okay, I'll answer these four, and I'll just try to be very sharp, short and crisp in trying to answer them, and probably take some others as well. So the first question is very important: that is it a long-term trend, or is it something which is just a aberration that we're actually seeing? I suspect that this is a long-term trend that we are actually seeing. It is not something which is just going to go away very quickly. Whether Joe Biden becomes the president or President Trump comes back, the question is going to be that what we are seeing is a long-term effect that we have actually seen, and it is a consequence of a very long-term thing. There might be a certain repulsion within the people of the United States that they actually elect Joe Biden as a president, but you will still have to grapple with the same set of issues that we are facing, or what the US faces or the world faces. It is about disparity. It is about, and disparity in many formats. In fact, if you really look at it, it's just not about income disparity. It is also about social issues. It's about discrimination that people can actually see or see within themselves. The Black Lives Matter issue is also something which is coming to the fore, and so on and so forth. But if I think that if Joe Biden becomes as a president, that is not a telling blow on this movement of populist leaders or whatever. The question is, it just gives us a chance, or it just gives US a chance to really reorient itself for something towards a little different thing that can happen. They can actually focus on issues because of which this has actually risen. And they have to set things right. They have to become intolerant to intolerance. Because what we have seen in the world, in fact, this is one of the biggest things that I have always said. The problem with liberal view was that they were just trying to accept every damn thing that was, even if it was actually wrong. So you cannot let that actually happen. If there is something wrong, it is wrong at this point in time and forever. So you have to point that out. We have started accepting a lot of things and so on and so forth. So that has actually caused this problem. So long-term effect, and I see this to last. In fact, the last time when it actually happened, the cycle did last for close to about 30 odd years. It started in the 1920s, went on until 1945, and that actually did get decimated, or it broke down because Hitler made a few mistakes. If Hitler did not make those few mistakes, I think we would still have been seeing a very different world, or whatever. So I also suspect that there is we are in the middle of something very, very important as a timeline, and that is that we can actually see a rise of an antichrist. And when I say an antichrist, there is going to be this whole huge thing of annexation of land, capitalism. In fact, I do not know if you've actually seen today's CNN headlines. The CNN headline today is very scary. One of the authoritarian leaders has actually said, prepare for war. And that leader is called Xi Jinping. So when he actually says that prepare for war, what does that actually mean? So his assertion or his absolute thing in terms of annexation of Taiwan, or the way things have actually happened with China in Tibet and so on and so forth. So those are very scary things to actually see. So who is going to be the next antichrist is going to be a question, whether it is actually going to come from China or whether it is actually coming from Turkey or somewhere in Europe or somewhere in the United States is a question that we will have to answer. But then there are those set of trends that we are actually seeing. So the global order is going to change very, very significantly. It has already changed. I think we are already seeing rise of a very different bipolar world right now. In fact, with the what I call reduced power of the Soviet Union and the rise of China, we are already seeing that it's the US bloc and the China bloc which is seeing. And there is this whole huge deglobalization that seems to be happening right now. Everybody seems to say, oh, we will look at manufacturing in different sets of locations, without realizing that the globalization has had its benefits. It has taken a lot of people out of poverty. It has just done something wonderful. But now the question is that I would relate it to the capitalism question here, that what has gone wrong there? I think capitalism, the mistake was that it was not, the enterprises were becoming too large. I think our policies were actually just not letting people create enterprises on their own. Like the enterprise creation was very, very slow. So if you really want to see the next wave of capitalism, which is right, it has to be large set of enterprises have to be created. The appropriate competition needs to happen. It cannot be that the rule of three functions in the capitalistic world. The rule of three seems to function, which is that the top three firms will actually control close to about 80% of the market share for any business or any industry or whatever. You cannot let that happen. So regulatory systems will have to be set right to take it there. But at the end of the day, it's capitalism which actually does trigger a lot of innovation and things. So you cannot discard it. It's just a question of setting those things right. So this is where enterprises will also have to start finding smart solutions. The disparity that actually exists between the top person and the lowest rung person in an enterprise can run into 2,000 to 3,000 times the salary, which is absolutely obnoxious. You cannot actually do that. So is that 3 times, 4 times, 7 times, 10 times? That's a question for debate, but you need to actually get into those things. So people who are makers on the shop floor have to get equally recognized and given credit, and rather than the top guy and things, or just the top guy actually getting all that credit. So that's something wrong. So what I always say is that, or what people like Mark Kramer would actually say, that creating shared value. Stuart Hart will say, in terms of like conscious capitalism and so on. And so to create those sets of things, that is what we'll have to move towards. And then why losers are getting, the question was that why people who have lost out are embracing people like Trump or whatever. Because I think the whole thing is based on the concept of being a messiah. Because a lot of people think that, oh, here is a messiah who's going to save us from all these things in the world. That is what they're actually selling, even if they have a solution or not. People who are left out, they're just looking at somebody to come and give them a leaf to really sit on or just help or whatever. That's what is actually happening. Because people, at the end of the day, I think they need that big motivation to move ahead, and then these guys just provide that motivation. So they are this, like those new age religious gurus also, like who would actually just try to capture the imagination and go for it. So it's like, sorry for saying it, but these are like those organizational behavior coaches who actually make a lot of noise but but don't make any sensical comment. I'm so sorry for saying it, but I find that to be one of the most obnoxious areas of research and things. So not meaningful, but whatever. It looks very exciting to people. That's what it is.
Well, thank you so much.
I hope I made some sense.
Yes, a lot of sense. So we have a few questions on the chat. Let's start with Huzuma. Can you unmute yourself to ask your question if you're here with us? Oh, or maybe Iman can unmute her. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. Can you
Hi,
hear
go
me?
ahead, ask your question. If you can keep it to 30 seconds, please.
Yeah, sure. When you started, Mr. Um, sorry, when you started talking about British people, you said they voted for leaving the European Union due to a low income for citizens. So, my question was why only the solution was to leave or staying in the European Union? Why didn't they take another solutions to improve the living of people? So, actually, as citizens of the United Kingdom, they would maybe believe that a change is good for them. So that maybe that's why they fought for leaving the European Union, don't exactly knowing the consequences of it. So I just want to know why staying or leaving is the main solution for the low income.
So, Kuzma, if I pronounce your name right, um, I think it's a very important question for us to really grapple with as to why people voted for that. I think it was a wrongly dealt political card by the then then prime minister, who felt that the no voters or the exit vote is not, or the Brexit vote is not actually going to fail, and without realizing that the underlying current was absolutely way too strong for a Brexit or whatever. And the disenchantment within the minds of the people at that point in time was so strong, and it was driven by that whole immigration sentiment. So, if you really look at it, there's something very interesting. There's another number that you can actually look at. Uh, so, places where immigrants were actually staying, say like London or Manchester and things. So, that is where a lot of immigrants are. They did not vote for Brexit in a big number because they actually were accustomed to immigrants and things, and they were actually positive about their contribution. But places which were not seeing a large number of immigrants staying, that is where that whole what do you call devil's view kind of a thing actually existed, which was, oh, immigrants are actually going to take away the jobs and so on and so forth. So there was this whole fear psychosis that was actually built in, and that was also driven through a very huge religious sentiment. I think a lot of us do not want to actually grapple with this issue. We always want to shove it under the carpet. But it was also driven by a religious view and a very biased view towards a certain religion that seemed to have crept the whole world. And that's a tragedy that we are actually talking about. And that, so this is also something, the underlying factor has been what you would actually call, and I'm sorry for saying it, but then the question is, it seems to be like the clash of the civilizations, or the rise of what you would call as the Christian world and the Islamic world, and they're just trying to see what is happening, and that is also there. Nobody wants to talk about it, but then there are that drawing room chatter still exists. The numbers actually tell you that this is actually happening, and we do not want to actually grapple with it. So we need to find answers to those solutions or these problems. We need to find solutions for it as to how do we do it. In fact, my solution, I've always been very categorical in terms of saying that, like, religion is a very, or belief is a very personal effort. Let it be in my room, in my drawing room. It should not actually go out on the streets, and that is how things will actually have to get solved. Let me do what I want to do. Let anybody do what he or she wants to do. Let's not talk about it. Politics should actually be on solving problems, solving challenges, disparity that actually exists either in economic terms or whatever. And in fact, this pandemic has also exposed lot of other disparities. In fact, something like, say, the digital divide that actually exists. And now suddenly this pandemic is going to push the world back by a multiple number of years. In fact, because of 1 year of college, which is not happening, or 1 year of schooling, which is not happening, is going to push back the generation by 4 to 5 years. And that is going to be another challenge. So that disparity will increase, and probably income levels, probably in 20 years' time, we will actually see a very different kind of a world, and where income levels for these people will not be as big or as huge as it should have actually been. So we need to find solutions in that set of stories. And then Brexit is also a very interesting reflection of that. And there is also this underlying feeling in Britain, which I see, and that they feel that, oh, as long as they were ruling the world, it was a very different view and things. And now suddenly they just lost out, and everything is just wrong with the globalized world, without realizing that it was this whole thing was actually seeped in Britain's failures, and it was seeped into Britain's exploitation of its territories or countries that they were actually ruling at that point in time. and the kind of mess that they've actually left behind. In fact, if you really look at it, I think there has to be, look at the mess that they've actually left behind and say something like a place like, say, when they created India and Pakistan, that the whole division which was done on the basis of religion was itself very, very wrong. In fact, that was a division that they created. It should not have actually happened. And they probably, the whole thing is actually snowballed into something very interesting or very, very dangerous. I hope I made some sense for you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kapoor. Let's move on to our next question. Mirna, can you unmute yourself, or Iman can unmute you so you ask your question?
Yes, hi. First, I would like to thank you, Professor, for the fascinating talk. It's very insightful. My question was, on what basis do countries like England decrease their democracy, while India's democracy increases? Does it only depend on the economy? Thank you.
Mirna, could you elaborate your question a bit, if possible, please?
I don't understand on what basis do some countries increase or decrease their democracy levels when dealing with pandemics. Yeah. So I'm wondering if it has some sort of basis or specific level, or is it just the economy? Thank you.
Okay. No, so your question is like, if I get your question right, Marina, I think the question is that whether democracies become more authoritarian in the times of the pandemic. If that's the question, I think there is always a danger that a lot of democracies can actually move towards more authoritarian systems during the times of the pandemic. And that the question that we have to grapple is that during the times of the pandemic, okay, now there are some rights which are going to be taken away, which say that, oh, you're not supposed to go out, you wear a mask, you do X, Y, Z. They're okay till the time the pandemic is there, but I hope they do not actually become long-lasting effects. There is also going to be some bit of surveillance, which is actually going to happen. So when you have all these tracking things that are actually happening in terms of the contact that you actually have or the contact tracing thing, the question here is that I hope it does not become permanent in terms of saying, oh, I'll be able to contact trace everybody. So you have to create systems or democratic institutions which stall that process. And this is where it becomes very important. So if you say, what are the pillars of democracy, each one of them will have to function independently. So the press will always have to be very important in terms of how the freedom of press is actually there, how they talk about things. What I always see in press, in fact, Noam Chomsky did write way back in the past that it is all about manufacturing consent. And whether it is left-wing, right-wing, liberal, non-liberal, whatever, there is always this view of manufacturing consent, and that is actually driven by the powers of that actual point in time. In fact, this is also something very interesting. History is always written by the winner and not by the loser. In fact, there's a philosophical statement that it's the hunter who writes the history, not the tiger, because tiger is not able to write. So those are a very important set of questions that we have to answer. So who's writing that history? How are we really looking at things that we need to answer and grapple with? So if you really look at it, I think it's always going to be that we have to set things right, let people think, and let the institutions work properly. So the press has to work properly, educational system, the executive, politicians and everything, and the judiciary, each one of them will have to be independent and work independently. But the challenge is going to be when all these things will actually connive. If there is that whole, what I call collusion that actually happens between these four people, then rest assured democracy is destroyed. In fact, what we are seeing in the United States, I think this whole debate that is actually happening, whether the present president should actually nominate the new Supreme Court judge, is exactly this fight, because that would actually be a collusionary thing that can actually happen. Because so close to the end of the tenure, he wins, he has absolutely all the right to nominate his candidate. But when you're actually just about to demit office in no time, there is a new election which is just happening in less than 2 weeks or 3 weeks. I think you should actually do a very different way of looking at things. So those set of things should not actually happen, because they can actually lead to failure of democracy.
All right, we have the next question is from Mr. Ahmed Shaheen. If you can unmute yourself, please. Ahmed, are you with us? Or Iman, can you unmute him, please?
Hello, thank you for this lecture. I have one question. It's regarding the social divide that is becoming a global issue. As you can see, it's not only about the US or Britain. You can see it everywhere in the world. What is the solution that can be taken in order to mitigate this danger, in order for the world not to go into a third world war? Thank you very much.
So I think, Ahmed, you're going back to Dina's question again, and that is, if you're really talking about a divide that actually exists, this is at the heart of the capitalistic system. It's the heart of the capitalistic model that we're actually living on. So, like, the biggest thing is that, and I am convinced on this fact, there are 2 or 3 things that will have to be done. One is that social objectives and economic objectives will have to come together. I think we will have to drop our obsession with GDP as a measure of success of economies. You'll have to move towards a very different model of measurement of success. The different measurement of success is going to be, say, quality of life, or ease of living, or or happiness, or whatever way you want to actually look at it. In fact, I just did a piece a few months back with HBR, which is available online, in terms of like, how do we actually go beyond GDP as a measure? And that is what you have to look at, because GDP is just a very simple monetary success. Non-GDP measure has to be looked at, because at the end of the day, the population across the board wants great healthcare, great education, clean air, and so on and so forth. Dina did allude to a very important point in one of her questions, and that was about climate change. So if you really look at it, is the very existence of the human race, and nobody wants to talk about it for some odd reason. The climate change is going to kill us. In fact, I think there is some scientific model, if I remember that correctly, which says that in the next 1500 years, the human race could actually or possibly go extinct. If the human race is going extinct because of climate change, that means that it's a very interesting, or it's a very big question as to how the race survives. But at the end of the day, the planet will survive. The race will actually go away. But so there's nothing wrong with that. On a time scale, humans are very, very arrogant as a species. So we simply deserve to vanish, because we have actually been very, very arrogant as a species. We've never been respectful of environment. We have never cared for the earth. And so the nature is going to take its own course and say, okay, just exit. There are other species who have exited, we will exit, and there would be some new evolutionary thing that will actually happen, which could be far more beautiful than what we are, and probably more intelligent than us. We have a facade of being intelligent, but we are fairly dumb as a species. If you really look at it, we just want to live under that facade of understanding that, oh yes, we are super intelligent or whatever. In fact, rather than believing that we are the dumbest creatures to have actually walked on the earth, we are living in the middle of the 6th mass extinction, and which we have actually caused for ourselves. So question that. That is what you have to set right. That's the new model. And if you don't do it in the next 200 years, it's actually going to be a very bad situation. In fact, there is a very possible thing that this whole COVID is also accentuated by climate change. If that is true, that means it's a warning bell for us as a species that wake up, or you're on your way out.
All right. The next question is from Mr. Ahmed Tag. If you can unmute yourself, please.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for the interesting talk and the notions you've shared with us. I have 2 questions. I hope you can hear me, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great. My first question would be about the point you've mentioned, that there's always a messiah that presenting himself as a savior for the world. But for now, it's kind of a reality show messiah. People mixing between being honest and serving humanity with being rude and being demagogue. So how can we go against or change that phenomenon? This is my first question. My second question would be, there's that quote for Slavoj Žižek, which says it's easier to imagine an end to the world than the end of capitalism. Based on the points you have said, what would be your reflection on
that? Based on my points, what will be the reflection on?
On the quote. Have you heard the quote? May I repeat it?
Yeah, please. Last one, please.
Okay. There's that quote for Slavoj Žižek. it says that it's easier to imagine an end to the world than an end to capitalism. Yeah, based on the points you have mentioned, how would you reflect on such a quote?
Okay. Oh, that's a question.
Thank you.
Okay. So when you're saying that messiahs, so like, how do we get rid of messiahs or whatever? I think that is where I did say something to begin with in terms of how education is going to be something very, very important. Education plays such an important role in terms of how we look at things. In fact, this is where we will have to, as a set of people, when we get educated, we start questioning beliefs, we start questioning assumptions or whatever. And I think we need to enable everybody of critical thinking. I think what is absent today from our education system, and at the school level, as I say, it's not the university. I think we need to give that critical thinking at the school level. So you push that thing into our minds or into the minds of the kids. Question every damn thing that you're actually looking at. Break the assumption that you're looking at. Assume is as of you and me. That's how you write assume. ASSUME. So break that assumption. Break every damn assumption that you're actually looking at. And if you're able to question that, that is when you don't actually fall prey to the messiah view. The messiah view is because at the end of the day, I think the whole structure, the societal structure is also based on, I always say, on the idea of a dog kingdom or a wolf kingdom. Oh, there is going to be somebody at the top and there is going to be a hierarchy that actually exists. So as long as we conceive the world to be a hierarchy, that is when things are actually going to be like this. Because when you actually have a hierarchy, either in your mind, in your social structure or whatever, then you actually see, oh, there is going to be a messiah who's going to be coming here. There is going to be a God who's going to actually come and help me or whatever. So we need to have a far bigger view or a more pragmatic view. It is us who will have to contribute. It is us who will have to change the world. It is not going to be an external force who's going to come and change the world for us. That is what we have to look at. And then, of course, if you really look at it, on the capitalism things, the end of the world is going to come quicker and things. That was a quote that you actually said, right? And then I don't think so. I think capitalism can solve the problems. And I think there is a there is a certain view that capitalism is the solution. It's not socialism. Socialism also has its own sets of problems in terms of saying, oh, it'll actually make everybody just not do any work at all. It is not going to be, you will not innovate, you will not actually struggle, and so on and so forth. But is it going to be that the end of the world is happening much sooner? I think we can solve the challenges that we actually face. And there are capitalistic solutions to everything that we are actually looking at. So capitalistic solutions for social problems, but non-exploitative solutions is the key. I think the problem is greed. Today, the world is driven by greed. I think all of us as a species within this become so greedy, so materialistic, so something which is so driven by accumulation of wealth. The success is driven by accumulation rather than success is driven by the idea of contribution. I think each one of us will have to say or question as to what is the contribution that I am making to the world or my society, than saying as to what is the accumulation that I'm actually able to do. So that is why I say go beyond GDP, because GDP is an accumulative behavior and social things are non-accumulative by nature. That is where you always say, what is the contribution that I make? I think all the great prophets, all the great thinkers have always said, a man is always supposed to be known by the contribution he makes, not by anything else. And that is what we have to look at.
Right, we have time for one last question from Mr. Muhammad Abdul Monaim. If you can unmute yourself.
Hello, hi.
Hi, Muhammad. Please go ahead.
I had two questions I wanted to ask. One was that I've noticed a lot of nationalistic governments are more inclined to nationalistic ideas or ideology. They always deny climate change, like Trump. In Brazil, all these other places, they always deny climate change. And why is that? Why do they always work against it? The other question is that it's about the United States. Would actually, socialism, would it work in any kind of form in the States? That's all. Thank you.
So I think, when you're saying the rise of the nationalistic governments and whatever, I think the whole thing is that, the whole idea of a nation state is a very interesting idea in terms of saying that you are always saying, oh, it's the territory that I control. As I said, the whole idea of nation state at points in time seems like it is built on the whole idea of a wolf kingdom. the wolf will always mark its territory. And then that's what a nation state territory is also all about. I think for me, if I want to live in an idealistic world, I think an idealistic world is driven by humans, which is just wherein we are able to, walk into any place in the world. That is what it has to be. Why do we have to live like an animalistic view? Why should there be, I think there should be no visas. There should be no way that everybody should be able to be traveled. That's the idealistic world. In fact, when you talk about globalization means free movement of land and capital, but nobody wants to talk about free movement of labor. So why is it that labor is always seen as a big question and as a dangerous proposition? We have to say land, labor, capital, and now data. So there are three things which move freely. Land moves freely. When I say resources move freely, capital moves freely, data moves freely, but people can't move freely. Why should that actually happen? Because that actually happens because we've embedded in our minds that a nation state is just a way that it has to be, or there is a boundary that we have to look at. A world which is one, a world where you're able to say that the whole world is a family and that is how we have to move. That is going to be solving the problem. But then the next question that you actually do, and of course, then you also say the nationalistic governments are actually talking about, they're also talking about climate change deniers. In fact, who are choosing the nationalistic governments? People who are actually anti-science in some way or whatever. I think this whole view, as you look at it, there is also this debate between creationistic view and the Darwinian view to the world. The world is, of course, Darwinian. It's all about evolution, but then you actually don't want to believe in Darwin. You want to actually believe in the whole creationistic view. And then you will always deny all the science that actually exists. So if your very basic election is based on denial of science, you will deny everything that is based in science. Tomorrow, you'll actually start denying the idea of, say, atoms. You'll start denying the idea of something which has not been discussed in the past. And you actually, there was something that was written 5,000 years back, does not mean that we can't question it. I think each one of us has to have the ability to question every damn thing that has ever been written in the world. That is what academics is all about. That is what pursuit of knowledge is all about. Question every damn thing that has ever been written. And that's what my job is as a philosopher, thinker, or academic, or anybody who's actually working in business. And if socialism is going to solve, I don't think so. Socialism has never worked. Socialism always pushes people down in terms of, it reduces my ability to work. You have to get challenged. You have to get compensated for some of the risks that you take. But at the end of the day, how much is the question? Who accumulates the wealth is a question. How does it actually get shared is a question. So that is where the whole thing is. Over to you, Dina.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amit, for a really very fascinating and interesting and mind-opening discussion. And for those of you who joined late, Dr. Amit will be publishing soon a book called Disrupting Democracies, in which he discusses these ideas in more detail. I look forward to reading it. And thank you, Dr. Ali and the Gerhard Center for organizing this very interesting webinar and for inviting me to moderate it.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Dina.
Dina.
Thank you, Dina, for a marvelous moderation. Amit, as always, very, very eye-opener in terms of the ideas. You always get into a territory where nobody go there. So I really thank you, and I think it's been an interesting webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Ali. And be well and be safe. Thank you.
Thank you for all the participants for being with us and for asking very interesting questions. And good evening to everyone.
Okay. Let me just tell them a little bit about next week. Next week, we're going to have two doctors, Dr. Cassel Brown and Deneka from Fred Hollows Foundation. They're going to talk about eye care, sustainability, and the future of ending avoidable blindness and visual impairment. Fred Hollows has been under severe financial strains because most of the money under COVID went to COVID and away from other urgent things like blindness. And they actually had to sort of change a little bit of the way they do business. They've changed their business model. They've changed the way they've restructured the value chain. So I think it's a very interesting, webinar. Well, next Wednesday, 7 o'clock. Thank you again for attending. Thank you, Dina. Thank you, Amit.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.